I was sipping coffee in my Chicago apartment when the call came through. Ross Sutherland, a lawyer I'd never heard of, informed me that my great-uncle Phoenix had died and left me his farm in Vermont. The whole thing felt surreal. I barely remembered Phoenix, just fragments from childhood visits over 20 years ago. "Mr. Chang, there are some unusual stipulations in your great-uncle's will," Ross said, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who'd seen strange requests before. "But the property is substantial. 40 acres with a farmhouse and outbuildings. All taxes are paid up. You'll need to come sign the paperwork in person." I stared out my apartment window at the gray Chicago skyline. My lease was ending next month, and my graphic design job had gone remote last year. The timing was almost too convenient. "I'll be there," I told him. 3 days later, I turned onto a gravel driveway that wound through maple trees toward what was now apparently my property. The 2-story farmhouse stood weathered but solid, its white paint peeling in places. Fields stretched out on either side, overgrown with tall grass and wildflowers. Behind the house stood a large red barn, its paint more vibrant than the house, but still showing signs of age. I parked beside the porch, grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat, and stepped out. The air smelled different here, cleaner, with hints of grass and soil. The silence struck me immediately. No traffic noise, no neighbors, just birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The key Ross had given me worked smoothly in the front door. Inside, the house was surprisingly clean, with simple, sturdy furniture that looked decades old, but well-maintained. I walked through rooms filled with Phoenix's life, bookshelves packed with farming guides and history books, framed photographs of landscapes, handmade quilts draped over chairs. In the kitchen, I found a refrigerator humming quietly, stocked with basic supplies: milk, eggs, bread. Someone, probably Ross, had made sure I had what I needed for the first day. I set my coffee mug down on the counter and noticed a folded piece of paper taped to the refrigerator door. My name was written on it in shaky handwriting. I pulled it off and unfolded it. The note was written in the same unsteady hand, the letters pressing hard into the paper. Rules for surviving the Thompson farm. For Eli Chang, my great-nephew. 1. Never go outside after dark, no matter what you hear or see. 2. Check the barn every morning, but always keep the doors locked. 3. If you find a black goat, bring it to the barn without looking into its eyes. 4. If you hear "Pop Goes the Weasel" playing, lock yourself in the bathroom and sit in the tub until dawn. 5. If the television turns on by itself, leave the house immediately and don't return until the next day. 6. Never touch or eat the pears from the orchard. The apples are safe. Break any of these rules, and you will die. Phoenix Chang. I read it twice, then laughed under my breath. So, Great-Uncle Phoenix had been one of those eccentric old farmers with weird superstitions. I crumpled the note and tossed it into the trash can under the sink. I'd expected something like this after Ross's cryptic comments about unusual stipulations, but this was ridiculous. I spent the next couple of hours unpacking and exploring the house. 2 bedrooms upstairs, 1 bathroom, a study filled with more books and old farming journals. The place was solid, if outdated. The plumbing worked, the electricity was on, and the internet connection Ross had arranged was surprisingly good. When I'd had enough of the house, I decided to check out the property. The May afternoon was warm, the sun hanging bright in a clear sky. Behind the house, I found what must have been Phoenix's pride and joy, an orchard with neat rows of apple and pear trees. The apple trees were in bloom, white petals occasionally drifting down in the breeze. The pear trees stood in their own section, their flowers already gone, tiny fruits beginning to form. I walked past the orchard toward the barn. It was larger than it had appeared from the driveway, with double doors facing the house and a smaller side entrance. A heavy padlock secured the main doors, and when I tried the side door, I found it locked as well. I made a mental note to ask Ross for the keys when I met him tomorrow to sign the final paperwork. By evening, I was tired from the drive and exploration. I sat on the porch with a sandwich and a beer, watching the sunset paint the overgrown fields gold. The property had a peaceful quality that I hadn't expected. Maybe this inheritance wasn't such a bad thing after all. I could work remotely from here, save money, maybe even fix the place up. As darkness settled over the farm, I finished my beer and stood to go inside. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural groan coming from the direction of the barn. I froze, listening. The sound came again, followed by what seemed like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I squinted into the darkness. The barn was just a looming shadow now, the last light of day nearly gone. The dragging sound continued, punctuated by another moan that raised the hair on my arms. It didn't sound like any animal I recognized. Something about those noises triggered a memory of Phoenix's note. Specifically, the first rule. Never go outside after dark, no matter what you hear or see. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the evening air. I stepped back, nearly knocking over my chair. The sounds from the barn grew louder, more insistent. I hurried inside, locked the door behind me, and flipped on every light in the downstairs. Standing in the brightly lit kitchen, I could still hear the faint sounds coming from outside, but they seemed more distant now, less immediate. I told myself it was probably just some local animal, a raccoon or maybe even a bear. Vermont had black bears, right? But as I stood there listening, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was making those sounds in the barn was something I didn't want to meet. I stood at the edge of the yard staring at the barn while morning sunlight cut through the trees. My hands shook as I held the heavy padlock, the key ready but my courage wavering. The memory of last night's sounds made my skin prickle. Whatever had made those noises was either still inside or had somehow escaped. I took a deep breath and unlocked the chain, letting it fall with a heavy clank against the wooden door. The side entrance creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the dim interior. Light filtered through dusty windows and cracks between weathered boards, illuminating dancing dust particles and slanted beams. My breath caught when I saw the floor. Fresh red stains splattered across the hay-covered ground, some still glistening wet in the morning light. The marks looked like something had been dragged, or worse, had thrashed around violently. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. The barn remained silent except for the distant chirping of birds outside. I stepped carefully around the stains, looking for their source. The barn was larger inside than it appeared from the outside, with stalls along both walls and a hayloft overhead. Farm equipment, some modern, some antique, lined the walls. A tractor sat covered with a tarp in the corner, and various tools hung from hooks and pegs. I checked every stall, looked behind every piece of equipment, and even climbed the rickety ladder to the hayloft. Nothing. No animals, no intruders, not even tracks in the hay beyond the stains. The chain and lock had been secure when I arrived, showing no signs of tampering. The windows were all intact, many too small for a person to fit through. What had made those sounds last night? And what had left these stains? I knelt to examine one of the larger splotches. It looked like blood, but I couldn't be certain. I touched it gingerly with my fingertip and rubbed it between my fingers. It was tacky, not fully dried. A sudden breeze made the barn door creak, and I jumped to my feet, heart racing. The rational part of my brain insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe a wounded animal had somehow gotten in and then escaped. Maybe Phoenix had kept livestock I didn't know about. Maybe kids from nearby farms were playing pranks. None of these explanations felt right. I locked the barn carefully behind me and walked back to the house, wiping my stained finger on my jeans. Inside, I washed my hands thoroughly with hot water and soap, scrubbing until my skin turned pink. Phoenix's note. I needed to look at it again. I went to the kitchen and pulled the crumpled paper from the trash can. It was stained with coffee grounds and something sticky, probably jam from this morning's toast. I smoothed it out on the kitchen table, flattening the creases with my palms. Rules for surviving the Thompson farm. The handwriting was shaky but determined, like Phoenix had forced himself to write even as his hand trembled. 1. Never go outside after dark, no matter what you hear or see. 2. Check the barn every morning. Keep it locked at all times except when necessary. 3. If you see a black goat, do not look into its eyes. Lead it to the barn and lock it inside. 4. If you hear Pop Goes the Weasel playing anywhere on the property, go to the bathroom, lock the door, and sit in the tub until sunrise. 5. If the television turns on by itself, leave the property immediately. Do not return until the next day. 6. Never eat fruit from the pear trees in the orchard. Yesterday, I'd laughed at these rules. Now, with the memory of those unnatural sounds and the unexplained stains fresh in my mind, I wasn't laughing anymore. I folded the note carefully and placed it in my wallet. Whether I believed in the supernatural or not, something strange was happening on this farm. Until I understood what, following Phoenix's rules seemed like the safest option. For the next 2 weeks, I fell into a routine. Each morning, I'd approach the barn with caution, unlock the heavy padlock, and inspect the interior. The chain was always secure, showing no signs that anyone or anything had tampered with it. Yet almost every day, I found new evidence that something had been inside. Fresh red stains splattered across the hay, deep gouges in the wooden posts or hay that had been disturbed and piled in unnatural formations. I documented everything with my phone camera, creating a growing album of unexplainable phenomena. The stains never formed any pattern I could discern, and they always dried to a rusty brown by afternoon. I took samples, sealing them in plastic bags I found in the kitchen, but I had no way to test what they were. During daylight hours, I explored the property, always keeping the house or barn in sight. The orchard was particularly beautiful, with apple trees heavy with ripening fruit. I carefully avoided the pear trees, their fruit looking deceptively normal but forbidden, according to Phoenix's 6th rule. I tried calling Ross several times to ask about Phoenix's history with the farm, but our conversations remained frustratingly vague. He seemed uncomfortable discussing anything beyond the legal aspects of my inheritance. Phoenix was particular about the property, Ross told me during one call. He insisted on those rules being passed along. Beyond that, I really can't say more. Did he ever explain why? About the rules, I mean. A long pause followed. Mr. Chang, I've handled the Thompson estate for 30 years. The rules came with the property long before Phoenix's time. I suggest you follow them. He changed the subject after that, and I didn't push further. At night, I stayed inside as the rule dictated. The sounds from the barn continued, sometimes scratching against the walls like massive claws seeking entrance, other times a rhythmic thumping so powerful it seemed to shake the foundation of the house. On the worst nights, I heard what sounded like words in a language I couldn't identify, spoken in a voice too deep and guttural to be human. I tried recording the sounds, but my phone only captured static and distortion. When I played the recordings back in daylight, they contained nothing but white noise and occasional pops that might have been digital artifacts or something else entirely. By the end of my 2nd week at the farm, I'd developed my own additions to Phoenix's rules. I kept all windows covered after sunset. I never responded to the sounds, no matter how they seemed to call my name. And I always kept a flashlight and my car keys within reach, just in case. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy fog that clung to the ground and wound between the trees like ghostly fingers. After my usual barn check, more stains, arranged almost in a circle this time. I made coffee and sat on the porch, watching the mist shift and swirl across the fields. The fog seemed to thicken rather than burn off as the morning progressed. By 10 o'clock, I could barely see the barn, just its dark outline against the white backdrop. Something about the unnatural density of the fog made me uneasy. I decided to go back inside. As I stood to return to the house, I noticed movement at the edge of the yard. A dark shape emerged from the fog, resolving into the form of an animal. A goat, larger than any goat I had ever seen, with pitch-black fur that seemed to absorb the light around it. Rule 3 flashed in my mind. If you see a black goat, do not look into its eyes. Lead it to the barn and lock it inside. The goat stood perfectly still, watching me. I kept my gaze fixed on its chest, fighting the strange, magnetic urge to look up into its face. Even without direct eye contact, I felt its attention like a physical weight. "Okay," I said quietly, more to steady myself than to address the animal. "Let's go to the barn." I stepped off the porch and approached slowly. The goat didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. As I got closer, I noticed its skin had an unnatural sheen, and the fog around it behaved strangely, curling away as if repelled. When I was about 5 feet away, I turned slightly, gesturing toward the barn. "This way," I said, keeping my voice calm despite the hammering of my heart. The goat followed. I felt it behind me, though its hooves made no sound on the damp ground. The air around us grew colder with each step, and I could see my breath forming clouds in front of my face. When my hand brushed accidentally against the goat's flank, I jerked away from the contact. Its skin was ice cold and had a texture that wasn't quite right. Not the coarse hair I expected, but something smoother, almost slick. We reached the barn, and I fumbled with the lock, my fingers clumsy with cold and fear. The goat waited patiently, too patiently, standing close enough that I could smell it, an odd metallic scent mixed with something earthier and more ancient. Finally, the lock opened. I pulled the chain free and pushed the door wide, stepping aside. "In there," I said, pointing. The goat entered the barn, its movements fluid and graceful despite its size. Once inside, it turned to face me. I kept my eyes lowered, focusing on its chest, but in my peripheral vision, I caught a glimpse of its eyes, dark pits that seemed to go on forever. I slammed the door shut and fumbled with the chain, threading it through the handles and snapping the padlock closed. As soon as the lock clicked, a sound came from inside the barn, a noise no natural goat could make. It started as a low moan, then rose in pitch until it became almost a scream. The sound had syllables, patterns that almost formed words. It was trying to speak. I backed away from the door, then turned and ran toward the house. Behind me, the goat's cries grew more frantic, more human. The sound followed me across the yard, cutting through the fog like a physical thing. Inside, I slammed the door and locked it, then leaned against the wall, breathing hard. The goat's cries were muffled now, but still audible. A rhythmic series of sounds that might have been my name. I slid down to sit on the floor, my back against the door, and covered my ears with my hands. But I could still hear it calling, still feel the pull of those bottomless eyes I'd nearly looked into. Phoenix's rules suddenly felt less like the paranoid instructions of an eccentric old man and more like a survival guide. Whatever that thing in the barn was, it wasn't a normal goat. And whatever had been making those nightly sounds, leaving those stains, I was no longer sure I wanted to know. I listened as the goat's unnatural sounds persisted for hours, a strange mixture of moans and almost words that made my skin crawl. The cries echoed across the yard, sometimes rising to a frantic pitch before dropping to low, guttural groans that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. I paced the living room, checking my watch every few minutes, wondering if the sounds would ever stop. They did, finally, as the last orange light of sunset faded from the sky. The sudden silence felt almost as unnerving as the noise had been. I stood at the kitchen window, staring at the dark shape of the barn, half expecting the sounds to start again. But the farm remained quiet. I slept poorly that night, jerking awake at every creak of the old farmhouse settling. When morning came, I dragged myself out of bed, made coffee, and prepared for my daily barn check with more apprehension than usual. The padlock and chain were exactly as I'd left them, securely fastened with no signs of tampering. I unlocked the heavy padlock, pulled the chain free, and pushed open the side door, bracing myself for what I might find. The barn was completely empty. I stepped inside, looking around in confusion. No black goat. No animal of any kind. Not even hoofprints in the dirt floor. Just the usual red stains that appeared each morning. I walked the entire length of the barn, checking each stall, looking behind hay bales, even climbing up to the hayloft. Nothing. "Where did you go?" I asked the empty space, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet barn. I knelt to examine the fresh stains on the floor. They formed no pattern I could discern, just random splashes like something had thrashed around violently. I took out my phone and snapped several photos, adding them to my growing collection of evidence. Back in the house, I added notes to my journal about the vanishing goat. I'd been documenting everything strange since arriving at the farm, hoping to make sense of it all. So far, the mysteries only deepened. 3 weeks into my stay at the Thompson farm, I'd settled into an uneasy routine. During daylight hours, I explored the property, worked remotely on my graphic design projects, and tried to convince myself there were logical explanations for everything happening here. At night, I stayed locked inside, listening to the strange sounds from the barn while pretending they didn't terrify me. On Wednesday afternoon, I was sitting in the living room, reading one of Phoenix's old farming journals. The windows were open, letting in a pleasant breeze that carried the scent of apple blossoms from the orchard. For a moment, everything felt almost normal. Then I heard it. The first few notes of "Pop Goes the Weasel" playing outside. The sound was distorted and slowed down, like a child's music box with dying batteries. The cheerful melody twisted into something sinister at that tempo, each note hanging in the air a beat too long before the next one came. Phoenix's fourth rule flashed through my mind. If you hear "Pop Goes the Weasel," lock yourself in the bathroom tub until sunrise. I dropped the journal and ran. Through the living room, down the hallway, into the bathroom. My hands shook as I slammed the door and turned the lock. I climbed into the old clawfoot bathtub, pulling my knees to my chest as the melody continued outside, seeming to circle the house. The tune played through once, then stopped. The silence lasted maybe 30 seconds before it started again, slightly closer this time. I pressed my back against the cold porcelain of the tub, straining to track the sound's movement. It stopped again, started again, each cycle bringing it closer to the house. An hour passed, maybe 2. The melody continued its stop-start pattern while I sat frozen in the tub, muscles cramping from holding the same position. Then I heard something new. Footsteps on the roof directly above me. Slow, deliberate steps that didn't sound human. Too heavy, too measured. The ceiling creaked under their weight. The footsteps paced back and forth while "Pop Goes the Weasel" continued playing somewhere outside. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The melody seemed to bypass my ears entirely, playing directly inside my head. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself. "This can't be real." But I knew it was. The rules weren't the paranoid ramblings of an eccentric old man. Phoenix had been trying to keep me safe from whatever inhabited this farm. The night stretched endlessly. I dozed off occasionally from sheer exhaustion, only to jerk awake at some new sound, scratching at the bathroom window, whispers in the walls, the doorknob slowly turning despite the lock. Each time I woke, the music was still playing its twisted melody. Finally, the first gray light of dawn filtered through the small bathroom window. The footsteps above had stopped. The music faded note by note until silence settled over the farm once more. I waited another hour before unlocking the bathroom door. my body stiff and sore from spending the night in the tub. The house was quiet and undisturbed. No sign anything unusual had happened. I made coffee with shaking hands and took it out to the porch, needing fresh air and sunlight. Sitting in the morning quiet, watching goldfinches dart among the tall grass, I tried to make sense of what was happening at the Thompson farm. Something truly strange lived here. Something that could appear as a black goat, vanish without a trace, play creepy music, and walk on the roof. Something that left stains in the barn every night and rearranged things when I wasn't looking. Something that followed rules I was only beginning to understand. Yet despite these frightening experiences, I found myself oddly reluctant to leave. During daylight hours, the farm was surprisingly peaceful. The air smelled cleaner than in Chicago. The silence wasn't oppressive but refreshing after years of constant city noise. I could work on my laptop sitting under an apple tree with no neighbors, no traffic, no distractions. I walked to the edge of the property, looking out over fields that now belonged to me. The morning sun turned the tall grass golden. Wildflowers nodded in the breeze, and birds called from the maple trees lining the driveway. For the first time, I began to understand why the Thompson family had remained here for generations, despite everything. This land offered a sense of freedom I'd never experienced in the city. Open space, privacy, connection to something larger than myself. During the day, at least, it felt worth the nighttime terrors. I turned back toward the house, seeing it differently now. Yes, it came with rules and dangers I didn't fully comprehend. But it also offered something rare and valuable, a place that was truly mine, where I answered to no one. The isolation that had initially seemed like a drawback now felt like an advantage. No neighbors meant no one to question my comings and goings. No one to judge my choices, no one to intrude on my thoughts. Just me and whatever entity shared this land with me. I walked back to the porch and sat down, sipping my coffee and watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. The farm had tested me last night, and I had passed by following Phoenix's rules. I wondered what other tests awaited me and whether I had the courage to face them. I was making a sandwich in the kitchen when the television turned on in the living room. The sound of static crackled through the walls of the old farmhouse, making me freeze with a knife halfway through slicing a tomato. That was impossible. The TV wasn't just turned off, it was unplugged. I'd made sure of that when I first moved in, not wanting to waste electricity on an appliance I rarely used. I set down the knife and walked slowly to the living room doorway. The ancient box television that had probably been new sometime in the 90s sat on its wooden stand, screen filled with dancing black and white static. The cord lay clearly visible on the hardwood floor, several feet from the nearest outlet. "What the hell?" I whispered, not moving any closer. The static grew louder, the volume increasing without anyone touching the dial. It rose from a soft hiss to a roar that seemed to press against my eardrums. I backed away, bumping into the wall behind me. Rule 5. Phoenix's 5th rule flashed through my mind. If the television turns on by itself, leave the property until the next day. The static grew even louder, becoming a physical presence that filled the room. I turned and ran for the kitchen, grabbing my wallet from the counter and snatching my car keys from the hook by the back door. The noise followed me, seeming to seep through the walls and chase me down the hallway. I burst through the front door without bothering to lock it behind me, sprinted across the porch and down the steps. My car sat in the gravel driveway where I'd parked it that morning. The static was still audible even outside, pouring from the open door of the house like water. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before managing to unlock the door. I threw myself into the driver's seat, jammed the key in the ignition, and started the engine. The tires spun in the gravel as I reversed too quickly, then found purchase as I shifted into drive and sped down the long driveway toward the main road. In the rearview mirror, the farmhouse grew smaller. a white rectangle against the green backdrop of fields and trees. The sound of static faded with distance, but the memory of it seemed embedded in my ears, a phantom noise that wouldn't quite disappear. I drove without any clear destination in mind, just wanting to put distance between myself and whatever had happened back at the farm. After 20 minutes of random turns down country roads, I found myself approaching the nearest town, little more than a main street with a handful of businesses, a gas station, and the Hillside Motel on the outskirts. The motel was a single-story building with maybe 15 rooms, its neon sign missing a few letters so it read, H.L. Ide Mott L. I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot and sat for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. According to Phoenix's rules, I couldn't go back until tomorrow. I needed a place to stay. The motel office had a bell that dinged when I pushed open the door. A middle-aged woman with auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail looked up from behind the counter where she'd been reading a paperback novel. "Need a room?" she asked, marking her place in the book with a finger. "Yeah," I said, suddenly aware that I must look like a mess, face flushed from running, probably wild-eyed with panic. "Just for tonight." She nodded and reached for a registration card. $55. Cash or card? "Card," I said, pulling out my wallet with hands that still weren't entirely steady. I slid my credit card across the counter. She took it and began typing information into an ancient computer. The name tag pinned to her blouse read, Carmen Thomas. "You're from the Thompson place, aren't you?" she asked without looking up from the screen. I blinked in surprise. "How did you know that?" "Small town. Word gets around when someone new moves in, especially to that property." She handed back my card along with a room key attached to a plastic tag with the number 7. "Rooms at the end. Checkouts at 11. Coffee and donuts in the office starting at 7. I waited for her to ask why I was checking into a motel when I had a house just outside of town, or comment on my disheveled appearance. But she simply went back to her book. Her lack of curiosity was almost unsettling, as if people running from the Thompson farm was a regular occurrence. "Thanks," I said, taking the key. Room 7 was exactly what I expected. A double bed with a faded floral comforter, a small desk, a TV bolted to the wall, and a bathroom with a shower stall instead of a tub. The air smelled faintly of cleaning products and old cigarette smoke that no amount of air freshener could completely mask. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the silent television mounted on the wall. The thought of turning it on made my skin crawl after what had happened at the farm. Instead, I pulled out my phone and checked the time, just after 2 in the afternoon. The day stretched ahead of me with nothing to do but worry about what was happening back at the house. After pacing the small room for nearly an hour, I finally lay down on the bed and closed my eyes. I didn't expect to sleep, but the adrenaline crash hit hard, and I drifted off into an uneasy slumber filled with dreams of static and shadowy figures moving through my house. I woke up disoriented as evening light filtered through the thin curtains. My phone showed it was just after 8. I'd slept for hours, yet still felt exhausted. My stomach growled, reminding me that I'd left before finishing lunch. The motel had a vending machine outside, and I bought a sad-looking sandwich and a bag of chips, eating them at the small desk while staring at the wall. As the room grew darker with the setting sun, I found myself thinking about Freddie Bates, my closest neighbor who lived about a mile down the road. I'd met him briefly when I first moved in. He was a stocky man in his 60s who'd stopped by to introduce himself, bringing a basket of vegetables from his garden. He'd been friendly but had given the farmhouse an odd look, as if he was surprised to see someone living there. Maybe he knew something about the farm. At the very least, his house was close enough that he might be able to see if anything unusual was happening while I was away. I found his number in my phone contacts and called before I could talk myself out of it. The phone rang 4 times before he picked up. "Hello?" His voice was gruff, slightly wary. "Hi, Freddie. This is Eli Chang from the Thompson farm up the road." "Oh, hello there." His tone warmed slightly. "Everything all right? Don't usually get calls this time of evening." "I'm actually staying in town tonight," I said, trying to sound casual. "Something came up with the house. I was wondering if you've noticed anything unusual around the property today." There was a long pause on the line. When Freddie spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, as if he didn't want to be overheard. "Funny you should ask that. My dogs have been raising hell since sundown, all facing toward your place, won't stop barking, and they're not usually like that." A chill ran down my back. "Is that all?" Another pause. "Well, about an hour ago, I was out on my porch having a smoke, and I could swear I saw lights moving in your house. Like someone walking around with a flashlight going from room to room. Figured maybe you'd come back." My mouth went dry. "I haven't been back since this afternoon." The sound was non-committal but loaded with meaning. Well, whatever's going on over there, it's got my dogs mighty upset. Been trying to get them to settle down, but they just keep staring that way and barking. "Thanks for telling me," I said, my voice sounding hollow to my own ears. "You staying at the hillside?" he asked. "Yeah." "Smart move," he said simply, and I got the distinct impression he knew more than he was saying. "You planning on heading back tomorrow?" "That's the plan." "Well, good luck to you. Call if you need anything." The line went dead, and I sat staring at my phone for several long minutes. Lights moving through my house. Something walking from room to room while I sat in this motel room miles away. I barely slept that night, dozing fitfully and jerking awake at every sound. The hum of the air conditioner, footsteps passing outside my door, a car pulling into the parking lot. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the static-filled television screen and imagined shadowy figures moving through my house, touching my things. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I checked out at 10, nodding to Carmen, who again asked no questions about my stay or whether I was heading home. The drive back to the farm seemed both too short and endless, my hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly as I turned onto the gravel driveway. The house looked exactly as I'd left it from the outside. White clapboard siding, front door still standing open from my hasty exit. I parked and sat in the car for several minutes, gathering my courage. According to Phoenix's rules, it should be safe to return now, but the knowledge that something had been in my house while I was gone made my skin crawl. Finally, I got out and approached the front door slowly. The house was silent. No static. No sounds of movement. I stepped inside, half expecting to find the place ransacked, but the entryway and hallway looked untouched. Then I reached the living room doorway and stopped cold. Every piece of furniture had been moved. The couch, armchairs, coffee table, side tables, and even the TV stand, all had been shifted several inches from their original positions. But that wasn't what made my blood freeze in my veins. They had been arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the room, all facing inward as if set up for some kind of meeting or ritual. I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to step into the room. The furniture hadn't been randomly moved or tossed around in a search for valuables. This was deliberate, precise, a message of some kind. The television sat on its stand, screen dark, power cord still unplugged and lying on the floor. But someone, or something, had been here in my absence. Had walked through my house, had touched my belongings, had rearranged my living room into this perfect, impossible circle. Whatever inhabited the farm, whatever lived in the barn and played music boxes and appeared as a black goat, had been inside my house, and it wanted me to know it. I felt strangely drawn to the farm despite my frightening experiences there. It didn't make sense, not really. I should have packed my bags and left after the TV incident, after finding all my furniture rearranged in that perfect, impossible circle. Any rational person would have run. Yet here I was, still sleeping under this roof, still following the rules, still calling this place home. During daylight hours, the land seemed peaceful in a way that made the nighttime horrors feel almost like dreams. The soil was rich and dark, crumbling perfectly between my fingers when I knelt in what used to be Phoenix's vegetable garden. The well water tasted pure and sweet, better than anything that had ever come from my apartment tap in Chicago. And I actually enjoyed the isolation, the absence of car horns and neighbors' arguments and the constant hum of city life. I sat on the porch steps, watching bees drift lazily between wildflowers in the tall grass. The sun warmed my face as a light breeze rustled through the maple trees lining the driveway. It was hard to believe that just 2 nights ago, I'd fled this place in terror, spent the night in that dingy motel room while something moved through my house, rearranged my things. My gaze drifted to the barn. It stood silent and still in the daylight, its red paint vibrant against the blue sky. Whatever lived there seemed content to wait for darkness. On this warm afternoon, with hours of sunlight still ahead, I decided to explore the orchard more thoroughly. I'd been keeping my distance from it, especially the pear trees, but the apple trees with their heavy, ripe fruit looked inviting. I walked across the yard, past the barn, giving it a wide berth despite the daylight, and into the neat rows of trees. The orchard was cooler, dappled shadows playing across the ground as sunlight filtered through the leaves. The apple trees came first, arranged in 5 perfectly straight rows, their branches heavy with fruit. I reached up and plucked a red apple from a low-hanging branch, wiping it against my shirt before taking a bite. It was perfectly sweet and crisp, with a complex flavor I'd never tasted in store-bought fruit. Juice ran down my chin as I took another bite, savoring it while walking deeper into the orchard. The pear trees stood beyond the apples, equally well tended, despite Phoenix's apparent avoidance of them. Their fruit hung heavy and golden, looking even more tempting than the apples. Several had fallen to the ground, their sweet scent filling the air as they began to rot. I remembered Phoenix's 6th rule: never eat fruit from the pear trees. I kept my distance, finishing my apple down to the core, which I tossed into the tall grass at the orchard's edge. As I wiped sticky hands on my jeans, I noticed something odd about the pear trees. Moving closer, but not close enough to touch, I saw strange markings carved into their bark. The symbols resembled letters, but from no alphabet I recognized. They weren't English or Chinese characters, nor any other language I'd ever seen. Some looked like spirals, others like jagged lightning bolts or interconnected circles. They'd been carved deep into the bark, and the trees had grown around them, suggesting they were old, decades perhaps. I pulled out my phone and took several photos, capturing different trees and different symbols. Each pear tree had unique markings, but they all shared the same strange style. I wondered if Phoenix had carved them as some kind of warning system, but they looked older than his time here, much older. I backed away from the pear trees, feeling suddenly uneasy, despite the bright sunshine. The orchard no longer felt peaceful. Something about those symbols made my skin crawl, as if they were watching me, reading me, judging whether I belonged here. I returned to the house, washing the sticky apple juice from my hands and face. The kitchen clock showed 4:30, hours before sunset, but the memory of those strange symbols left me wanting the security of walls around me. That evening, after a simple dinner of pasta and canned sauce, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and pen. I felt compelled to document everything that had happened since I'd arrived at the farm, to create a record for whoever might come after me, just as Phoenix had done for me. I wrote about the barn sounds, the black goat, the music box melody, the self-activating television, and the rearranged furniture. I described the rules and how following them had kept me safe so far. I added my own observations about the strange symbols on the pear trees, including printouts of the photos I'd taken that afternoon. As I wrote, darkness fell outside the kitchen windows. I'd drawn the curtains and turned on every light in the house, a habit I'd developed since that first night. The familiar sounds from the barn started again, the scratching, the moans that almost formed words, the heavy dragging across the floor. But I no longer felt compelled to investigate. The curiosity that had initially driven me to check the barn each morning, to document the stains, to try recording the sounds, it had been replaced by a kind of resigned acceptance. Some mysteries were better left unsolved. Phoenix had known that, had lived with it for decades. I had learned to trust Phoenix's wisdom. The rules weren't the paranoid ravings of an eccentric old man. They were survival strategies, carefully crafted and passed down. They were a gift. I finished my notes, tucked them into a folder, and placed it in the desk drawer in the study alongside Phoenix's farming journals. Future evidence for a future inheritor should something happen to me. A passing of the torch. The sounds from the barn grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was out there knew I was thinking about it. I ignored them, making myself a cup of tea and sitting in the living room with a book I'd found on one of Phoenix's shelves, a history of Vermont farming communities. The furniture was back in its original positions. I'd moved everything myself the day after the incident, refusing to let whatever had entered my house dictate how I lived in it. The barn sounds continued into the night, but they had become almost like white noise to me now. Unsettling, yes, but familiar. Part of the farm. Part of what I had inherited. I woke up to the smell of coffee I hadn't made. Groggy and confused, I stumbled down the stairs, hand trailing along the wall for balance. My bare feet hit the cold kitchen tiles and I froze. There on the kitchen table sat a pear. Golden yellow and perfectly ripe. It rested in the center of the wooden surface, catching the morning light that streamed through the window. I hadn't picked it. I hadn't bought it. I certainly hadn't placed it there. I approached slowly, keeping my distance as if the fruit might suddenly move. The pear looked innocent enough, smooth skin with just a hint of blush on one side, but I knew better. Phoenix's sixth rule echoed in my mind. Never eat fruit from the pear trees. I scanned the kitchen. All windows remained locked from the inside, their latches exactly as I'd left them the night before. The back door's deadbolt was still engaged, and I'd been the only one with keys to the front door since inheriting the place. Yet somehow, this pair had appeared overnight while I slept. "How the hell did you get here?" I whispered, not expecting an answer. I grabbed a dish towel from the counter, careful not to touch the fruit directly. Wrapping the pear completely, I carried the bundle at arm's length to the back door. I unlocked it, stepped outside into the crisp morning air, and walked 20 yards from the house before digging a small hole with my heel. I dropped the towel-wrapped pear into it and kicked dirt over the top, burying it completely. Back inside, I washed my hands thoroughly with hot water and soap, scrubbing under my nails and between my fingers until my skin turned pink. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just disposed of something dangerous. More dangerous than a simple piece of fruit had any right to be. I spent the day working on graphic design projects, my laptop balanced on my knees as I sat in the living room armchair. I deliberately kept my back to the wall, giving me a clear view of both the front door and the hallway leading to the kitchen. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted toward the windows, searching the yard for movement. Nothing seemed out of place, but the knowledge that something had been inside my house while I slept left me on edge. Night fell earlier than usual as dark clouds rolled in from the west. I locked up meticulously, testing each window latch twice, checking both doors 3 times. Upstairs, I closed my bedroom door and wedged a chair under the knob. A childish precaution, perhaps, but it made me feel marginally safer. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind picking up outside. The familiar sounds from the barn started right on schedule. The groaning, the dragging, the almost words that had become the soundtrack to my nights here. Strangely, they'd grown less frightening over time. At least those sounds stayed where they belonged, in the barn. I must have drifted off eventually because I jerked awake to a new sound. A light, persistent scratching at my bedroom window. My eyes flew open, body instantly rigid. The scratching continued, like fingernails or claws dragging slowly across the glass. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was just a tree branch. But there were no trees close enough to the house to reach the second-floor windows. The scratching paused, then resumed with more intensity. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slid out of bed, keeping low to the floor. The scratching stopped again, as if whatever made it sensed my movement. I crawled toward the window, staying below the sill level. The curtains were drawn, but a sliver of gap remained at one edge. With trembling fingers, I reached up and pulled the curtain aside, just enough to peek through with one eye. The moon had emerged from behind the clouds, casting silver light across the yard. Nothing hung outside my window. No face, no creature, nothing at all. Just empty air and the drop to the ground below. I let out a shaky breath, about to pull away when something caught my eye. A dark shape moved across the moonlit yard, large and flowing like a shadow given substance. It moved with purpose toward the barn, its form shifting and changing as it went. I couldn't make out details, couldn't tell if it walked on 2 legs or 4, but its movement was wrong. Too fluid, too smooth for anything natural. I watched, paralyzed, as it reached the barn and seemed to melt into the shadows around the building. The night fell silent again. Even the usual barn sounds momentarily hushed. I backed away from the window, pulled the curtains tight, and spent the rest of the night sitting upright in bed with all the lights on, jumping at every creak of the old farmhouse settling. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as first light broke, I dressed quickly and headed downstairs, desperate for coffee and normalcy. I prepared a strong pot, gulping down the first cup while staring out the kitchen window at the barn. From this distance, everything looked perfectly normal. The red paint still peeling in places, the roof still missing a few shingles. But something felt off. I narrowed my eyes, studying the structure more carefully. The doors were open. Both the main double doors and the side entrance stood wide open, gaping like mouths into the darkness inside. I distinctly remembered locking them yesterday afternoon, as I did every day. The padlock and chain should have been secure on both entrances. I set my coffee cup down with a clatter, grabbed my jacket, and headed outside. The morning air felt unusually cold against my face as I crossed the yard, eyes fixed on those open doors. With each step closer, my pace slowed until I found myself almost creeping toward the barn. Standing at the threshold, I peered inside. The usual farm equipment sat in its places, the tractor still covered with its tarp, tools hanging on the wall, hay bales stacked in the corner. But something new had been added. Symbols covered the inside walls, the same strange markings I'd photographed on the pear trees. Spirals, lightning bolts, interconnected circles, all drawn in a deep red substance that glistened wetly in the morning light. They formed patterns across the wooden planks, some small and isolated, others flowing together in complex arrangements that hurt my eyes to follow. I stepped inside, drawn forward despite every instinct screaming at me to run. The symbols seemed to pulse slightly, though I told myself it was just a trick of the light filtering through the open doors. I recognized several markings from my photos of the pear trees, but many were new, more elaborate, more unsettling. The air inside felt thick, charged with something I couldn't name. The hair on my arms stood on end. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if the symbols themselves were eyes tracking my movements. I backed out quickly, grabbed the doors and pulled them shut with more force than necessary. My hands shook as I threaded the chain through the handles and snapped the padlock closed. The side door received the same treatment, secured with trembling fingers. All the way back to the house, the sensation of being observed followed me. A pressure between my shoulder blades, a weight on the back of my neck. I resisted the urge to run or look back, maintaining a steady pace until I reached the porch. Only then did I turn to face the barn again. It sat quiet and still in the morning light, doors now properly closed and locked. Nothing moved in the yard. No birds sang in the trees. The entire property held its breath. Inside, I paced the kitchen, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The symbols in the barn matched those on the pear trees too perfectly to be coincidence. Something was connecting these elements, creating a pattern I couldn't yet understand. I remembered Phoenix's farming journals in the study and spent an hour searching through them for any mention of the symbols. Finding nothing, I expanded my search to the rest of the house. The attic access was in the upstairs hallway ceiling, a square panel with a pull-down ladder I hadn't bothered to explore before. I tugged the cord, wincing at the screech of metal as the ladder extended to the floor. Dust rained down, making me cough. The attic space was surprisingly large, with a proper wooden floor and enough headroom to stand upright in the center. Boxes and trunks lined the walls, covered in varying thicknesses of dust. Some looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. I started with the cleanest boxes, assuming they were the most recently accessed. The third one I opened contained what I was looking for: journals, much older than Phoenix's, bound in cracked leather with yellowed pages. I carried the entire box downstairs to the kitchen table and began sorting through them. The oldest journal dated back to 1887, written by Elias Thompson, who identified himself as the third generation to own the farm. His handwriting was tight and precise, the ink faded to brown with age. The entries detailed experiences eerily similar to my own: barn noises, music playing from nowhere, furniture rearrangement, and the same 6 rules I'd found on Phoenix's note. Elias wrote of leading a black goat to the barn, of staying in the bathtub during music box melodies, of never going outside after dark. I moved to the next journal, this one from 1923, written by Martha Thompson. Her accounts matched Elias's, with additional notes about symbols appearing on walls and trees that needed to be respected but never replicated by human hand. Journal after journal told the same story: Thompson family members living on the farm, following the rules, experiencing the same phenomena I had witnessed. They spoke of the entity, never named, only referenced as it or the presence, that controlled the land and demanded adherence to its rules. Most disturbing were the accounts of those who hadn't followed the rules. Martha wrote of her brother William, who ate a pear in defiant jest and vanished the next day, his room found empty with the window open and strange marks on the sill. Elias documented his neighbor's son, who broke into the barn at night on a dare and was found the next morning, empty of blood and sense, staring at nothing, speaking words no human should utter. The most recent journal before Phoenix's belonged to his mother, May Chang Thompson. Her entries from the 1970s described how the Thompson bloodline continued through her marriage, ensuring the farm remained in family hands. She wrote explicitly about the pact, an agreement made by the first Thompson settler with whatever entity claimed the land. "The agreement is simple," she wrote. "We respect its domain, follow its rules, and in return, we may live here in relative peace. The farm will provide, the crops will grow, and we will be protected from outside harm. But the price of breaking faith is terrible. The entity does not forgive, does not forget, and does not show mercy to those who disrespect its ways." I closed the journal, my mind reeling. This wasn't just a haunting, not just a collection of supernatural phenomena. This was a covenant spanning generations, a pact between my ancestors and something ancient and powerful that considered this land its territory. The farm existed in a delicate balance, with the rules serving as the terms of an ongoing agreement. Phoenix hadn't been crazy or superstitious. He had been trying to prepare me to take my place in this generational contract. I gathered the journals, arranging them in chronological order on the kitchen table. Together with my own notes and photographs, they formed a comprehensive record of the Thompson farm legacy. I was just the latest caretaker in a long line, inheriting not just property but responsibility for maintaining the pact. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. From the barn came the faint sound of scratching, earlier than usual. I glanced at the kitchen clock, still 4 hours until sunset. The entity was active, aware. Perhaps it knew I had discovered the truth. Perhaps it was waiting to see what I would do with this knowledge. I touched the oldest journal, running my fingers over the worn leather cover. 7 generations of Thompsons had lived here before me, following the rules, respecting the pact. Most had survived, some hadn't. The choice now lay before me. Continue the tradition, follow the rules, and maintain the agreement, or leave this place and its strange covenant behind. But as I looked out the window at the land that was now mine, I knew the decision had already been made. Something in my blood recognized this place, understood its peculiar demands. I was a Thompson by inheritance, if not by name. And Thompsons kept their bargains, even those made with entities beyond human understanding. I heard the first tinkling notes of "Pop Goes the Weasel" from somewhere inside the house. My body reacted before my mind fully processed what was happening. The familiar melody played slower than normal, distorted like a dying music box, but unmistakable. This time it wasn't coming from outside or the roof. It was coming from my own living room. I dropped the book I'd been reading and bolted from the couch. The music grew louder as I ran down the hallway, my sock feet sliding on the wooden floor. Rule 4 echoed in my head. If you hear "Pop Goes the Weasel," lock yourself in the bathroom tub until sunrise. I slammed the bathroom door behind me, fingers fumbling with the lock until it clicked into place. The small bathroom felt even smaller as I climbed into the clawfoot tub and pulled my knees to my chest. The porcelain was cold against my back. The music continued, no longer muffled by the door, but somehow clearer, as if it had followed me. It played through once, then started again, louder this time. It seemed to be right outside the bathroom now. My breathing came in short gasps. This was different from the last time. Before, the music had stayed outside, circling the house like a predator. Now it was inside with me, hunting me room by room. The melody stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that felt heavy and expectant. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, a footstep, a creak, anything to tell me where the threat was. 3 precise knocks rapped against the bathroom door. Knock, knock, knock. Each one deliberate and measured, like someone testing the wood. Then silence again, thick and awful. I pressed my hand over my mouth to quiet my breathing. Whatever was on the other side of that door wasn't human. I knew that with bone-deep certainty. The doorknob rattled, turning left then right, testing the lock. The metal fixtures shook with increasing force, not like someone trying to open it, but like something wanting to make sure I knew it could get in if it wanted to. I held my breath, unable to move, unable to think beyond the immediate terror of being trapped in this small room with something trying to get in. My eyes fixed on the narrow gap between the door and the floor, the only vulnerable space in my barricade. A shadow passed across that gap, blocking the hallway light. Something thin and green slid under the door, coming to rest on the bathroom tiles. A pear leaf, fresh and green, like it had just been plucked from one of the forbidden trees. The music box melody started again, fainter now, moving away from the door and through the house. I stayed frozen in the tub, the leaf on the floor both a message and a warning. I didn't dare touch it. Hours passed. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every house creak and settling pipe. The bathroom window gradually lightened from black to deep blue to the gray of early dawn. Only when full morning light filtered through the frosted glass did I finally unfold my cramped limbs and step out of the tub. My muscles protested after hours curled in the same position. I stood over the leaf without touching it, studying its waxy surface and distinctive shape. It looked like a normal pear leaf, but its presence was anything but normal. I unlocked the door and pushed it open slowly, half expecting to find something waiting. The hallway stood empty and quiet. Too quiet. The house had that particular stillness that told me I was alone, or at least alone in the human sense. I stepped into the hallway and stopped short. The furniture had been moved again, but not into a circle like before. This time, every piece had been arranged to create a clear path from the bathroom to the front door. The couch had been pushed against one wall, the armchairs positioned to form a corridor, side tables and lamps creating a defined walkway through the living room. An invitation, or a command. I followed this eerie trail, moving cautiously through the rearranged living room. At the front door, I paused with my hand on the knob, suddenly certain of what I would find outside. The morning air was cool on my face as I stepped onto the porch. Dew sparkled on the overgrown grass, and birds called from the maple trees lining the driveway. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, except for the black goat standing by the barn. It was the same goat I'd seen before, or at least it appeared to be. Pitch black fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But something was different. Even from this distance, without looking directly at its face, I knew. I walked across the yard, keeping my eyes fixed on the goat's chest, remembering Rule 3. If you see a black goat, don't look in its eyes and lead it to the barn. As I got closer, I felt the strange pull to look up, to meet its gaze. I resisted, but something about the animal's presence felt familiar in a way it hadn't before. There was a stillness to it, a patience that reminded me of Phoenix. The realization hit me with absolute certainty. Somehow, impossibly, my great-uncle's consciousness looked out from behind those animal eyes. I couldn't explain how I knew. I just did, with the same instinctive recognition you might feel seeing a loved one from behind in a crowd. I stopped a few feet away, keeping my gaze lowered. "This way," I said, my voice sounding strange in the morning quiet. The goat followed me to the barn without hesitation. I fumbled with the padlock, my fingers clumsy with the knowledge of who, or what, stood behind me. The chain fell away with a clank, and I pushed the side door open. The goat walked past me into the dim interior. I followed, leaving the door open to let in light. The red stains on the floor seemed darker today, almost black in places. The goat moved to the center of the barn and turned to face me. "Eli," it said in Phoenix's voice. Hearing my name in my great-uncle's familiar tone from the goat's mouth sent a chill through me. The voice was exactly as I remembered from our rare phone calls, slightly raspy, with the careful enunciation of someone who chooses words deliberately. "You've passed the tests," the goat continued. "Not everyone does. William didn't. Others before him failed too." I kept my eyes on the goat's chest, fighting the urge to look up. "What tests?" "The farm has rules for a reason. The entity that dwells here demands respect, obedience. It tests each new caretaker to ensure they understand what's required. The music, the TV, the furniture, that was all. Tests." The goat made a sound that might have been a sigh. The farm entity requires sacrifice every generation, blood and service. But I made a deal when my time came. Phoenix's voice from the goat's mouth sounded tired, weighted with years of knowledge. "If you continue following the rules, you will remain safe. The entity will not harm you. It may test your resolve from time to time, but it will also protect what is yours." "What happened to you?" I asked, the question barely audible. "I chose to stay, to become part of this place as others before me have done. It was my time." The goat shifted slightly. "The choice will come for you too, but not for many years if you're careful." I wanted to ask more questions about the entity, about the rules, about what exactly Phoenix had become, but the goat turned away from me, walking deeper into the barn shadows. "Remember the rules, Eli," Phoenix's voice said, growing fainter as the goat moved away. They will keep you alive. They will keep you safe. I stood there long after the goat had disappeared into the darkness at the back of the barn. Eventually, I backed out, closed the door, and secured the chain and padlock with shaking hands. The farm spread out around me, the fields, the orchard, the house, all of it looking so normal in the morning light. But I understood now that I had inherited more than just property. I had inherited a covenant, a responsibility passed down through generations of Thompsons, and now, to me, Eli Chang. If I followed the rules, I would be safe. The entity would allow me to live here, to make this place my home. And somewhere in the shadows, Phoenix would be watching, making sure I remembered what he had taught me. I felt autumn approaching. The maple trees lining the driveway had started to show hints of orange at their edges, and the morning air carried a crispness that hadn't been there when I first arrived. I stood at the kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching a pair of chickadees flit between branches. The decision had been forming in my mind for weeks, but this morning, it crystallized into certainty. I was staying. Permanently. The thought should have terrified me. By all rational measures, it should have sent me packing my bags and calling a real estate agent. Instead, it settled over me like a comfortable blanket. I took my coffee to the study, where I'd spread out the journals of previous Thompson caretakers across the desk. My own notebook sat open beside them, half filled with observations, incidents, and questions. I added a new entry, September 15th, made the decision to stay permanently. Whatever tested me these past months has apparently found me acceptable. The farm feels right now despite everything. Or maybe because of everything. I ran my fingers over Phoenix's cramped handwriting in his final journal. His words about responsibility and legacy made more sense now. The farm wasn't just land and buildings. It was a covenant, a pact maintained through generations. And now, it was mine. The mysterious forces governing this place had put me through trials that defied explanation. The nightly barn sounds, the black goat that somehow contained Phoenix's consciousness, the music box melody that sent me hiding in the bathtub, the television turning itself on, the furniture rearrangements, and the forbidden pear trees with their ancient symbols. Each incident had tested my willingness to follow the rules, to respect boundaries I didn't understand, and I had passed. I had followed Phoenix's 6 rules to the letter, even when they seemed absurd. Never go outside after dark. Check the barn every morning. If you see a black goat, don't look in its eyes and lead it to the barn. If you hear "Pop goes the weasel," lock yourself in the bathroom tub until sunrise. If the TV turns on by itself, leave the property until next day. Never eat fruit from the pear trees. Simple rules, bizarre rules, life-saving rules. In return for this compliance, the farm had offered me something I hadn't expected: belonging. The city had never felt like home. Not really. My apartment had been a place to sleep, not a place to live. But here, despite the dangers lurking in the shadows, I felt connected to something larger than myself. I understood why the Thompson family had remained for 7 generations. I flipped through May Chang Thompson's journal from the 70s, stopping at a passage I'd read multiple times. The entity demands respect and adherence to its rules, but it also protects those who comply. Last month, when strangers tried to break into the house while I was alone, they never made it past the driveway. I found their truck abandoned the next morning, doors open, no sign of the men. The barn was unusually quiet that night. Protection, a strange sort of security in exchange for following inexplicable rules. A bargain that had sustained the Thompson bloodline for over a century. I picked up my pen again and added more notes to my journal. The entity seems to appreciate documentation. Each caretaker has kept detailed records. I'll continue this tradition, recording everything for whoever comes after me. The knowledge must be preserved and passed down. I spent the afternoon organizing all the journals chronologically, creating a complete historical record from Elias Thompson's first entries in 1887 to my own recent observations. I typed up a comprehensive summary on my laptop, printed it, and added it to the collection. Future caretakers would have an easier time understanding what they'd inherited than I had. As evening approached, I stepped onto the porch with a glass of whiskey. The sunset painted the fields gold, and a cool breeze rustled through the tall grass. Crickets had started their evening chorus, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. I felt strangely at peace despite knowing what creatures lurked in the darkness beyond my sight. The barn stood silent for now, but I knew that would change once night fell completely. The scratching would start, followed by moans and dragging sounds. The entity would begin its nightly activities, whatever they might be, and that was okay. I sipped my whiskey, watching the last light fade from the sky. Purple shadows stretched across the yard, and the first stars appeared overhead. The temperature dropped further, and I pulled my flannel shirt tighter around me. When only a thin line of orange remained on the horizon, I finished my drink and went inside. I locked the door behind me, checked that all windows were secure, and drew the curtains. My nightly ritual. I turned on lamps throughout the house, creating pools of warm light that kept the darkness at bay. Right on schedule, the sounds from the barn began. First, the scratching, like massive claws against wood. Then the low moans that almost formed words in a language I couldn't understand. Finally, the heavy dragging that sometimes shook the foundation of the house itself. I settled into the armchair by the fireplace and opened a book, letting the familiar sounds wash over me. They no longer frightened me as they once had. Instead, they seemed almost comforting, a reminder that I had become the 8th generation to call this cursed place home. And somehow, that felt exactly right.